Right, morning year 13. We're going to talk about 1984. Once again, I'll link it to Brave New World and, of course, to our text that we're studying, The Handmaid's Tale. Big Brother is watching you is perhaps the most famous quote in 1984. What we'll see is that 1984 is about a totalitarian regime based on fear, surveillance, aggression, torture, and violence. Clearly, Orwell is thinking of Marxist communist movements and of also perhaps of Maoist China. And what we'll see is how different this is from Brave New World, which is much more about consumerism, sexuality, intoxication being the way in which we coerce and control people. Okay? Orwell became a direct model for me much later in my life. In the real 1984, the year in which I began writing a somewhat different dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale. Now, on this presentation, you have an interview there with Margaret Atwood. I strongly suggest that you watch this interview, and it will give you quite a few ideas about the background of it. There it is, okay? What do we need to know about Orwell? Well, first of all, his real name was Eric Blair. He was an Etonian scholar, which means he won a scholarship to Eton, and he was actually in many ways not rich enough to go there. He'd been born in the colonies, and he wrote about them quite a lot. He was very anti-imperialist. He'd seen many things firsthand that he disagreed with. He became an international socialist, and he went and he fought in the Spanish Civil War. Now, in the Spanish Civil War, even though he fought for the socialist side, he began to see many dark elements of socialism, the coerciveness of it, the mindlessness of it, and the anti-individualistic nature of it. This, together with his readings of Stalin, in many ways made him very concerned about elements of communism. So we know that after the war that we've had people like Hitler, we'd had Stalin, and Stalin in particular is going to be a big figure. As many of you know, Big Brother seems to be based on Stalin's propaganda posters, okay? In Spain, as I said, Orwell had personally witnessed how individuals were crushed and how propaganda tried to brainwash different people. If we look at these posters, we can see, can't we, that Stalin was absolutely everywhere. Interestingly enough, he was also everywhere in Allied propaganda. He was referred to by the British as Uncle Joe, and that's why he's often presented as a nice, avuncular man with a smile of concern for his people. In terms of Big Brother, he is also described as a mustachioed man, ruggedly handsome. But if anything, there's something even more threatening in 1984. In both regimes, of course, these posters of the dictator were absolutely everywhere. Now, we know that in 1984, we're dealing with a world that had actually split into different spheres. We had Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. Now, quite clearly, we're meant to see parallels between this and what was actually happening in the Cold War. In the real Cold War, what would have happened would be most of the real concern would be what we call the Iron Curtain that would have divided Eastern and Western Europe. But let's not forget that the Cold War was fought on a global scale. Of course, it was fought a great deal in this region of the world, but also in Africa. And in terms of Southeast Asia, many of you will know about the Korean War, the Vietnamese War. In Thailand, there was a huge communist insurgency, and the Americans obviously supported them as much as possible. And of course, the country that I think terrified people most was when China became a communist country. That really meant that communism seemed to be threatening everybody at the time. Orwell was no fan of capitalism. And in many ways, he saw the potential for capitalism to become fascist. So he saw a world that was entirely polarized, conflict-ridden, etc. And that comes out of that Cold War. Now, what's of course so interesting, and this is something that many people have pointed out in communism in general, is that we have a rigid hierarchy. Obviously at the top we have Big Brother, we have an inner party, an outer party, and then the proles. I believe that Winston Smith, the main character in 1984, would be in the outer party there. That does mean that he has certain privileges. And what Orwell was very troubled about was this idea that communism in many ways said that it would abolish hierarchies, but actually we see rigid hierarchies, something that we're also going to see in Brave New World. And what is so terrible about this, and this is something that we're going to see in Handmaid's Tale, is that the inner party, or the apparatchiks, I believe is the Russian word, often have incredible luxuries, etc. And in The Handmaid's Tale, for instance, you'll see the way the commanders go to Jezebel's. They have access to prostitutes and to alcohol and to luxury goods, don't they? So one of the things that troubled Orwell was this idea of the corruption within communism and the hypocrisy thereof. As I said, 1984 is set in Oceania, okay? We see that the party seems to be closely patterned on the Bolsheviks, and it's led by Big Brother. We know, don't we, that thought crime is a particular sinister element of 1984. And as its name suggests, it is actually the desire to get inside your head and to monitor your thoughts. Now, I want you to connect AO3 to today's feelings about surveillance and how the CIA, etc., tapping into technology in this desperate attempt to find out everything. Another thing I want you to notice about thought crime is it's an example of Newspeak, which is a new kind of language which is manufactured by the state to control thought as much as possible. It often comes from compound words, obviously thought and crime being joined together to make this one particular word. Now, Winston, as we'll see in the beginning of the novel, is already disenchanted with Oceania and feels its corruption, etc. And the story charts his rebellion against the state and his love affair with a woman called Julia, who also hates the party. Interestingly enough, Julia disguises herself very effectively by being a member of the Anti-Sex League. So I want you to think about this really carefully, that 1984 is a society in which sex has almost been criminalized. Now that will have kind of parallels to, say, Maoist China, where sex is seen as decadent. Now that's going to be very different from Brave New World, where sex is something to actually exploit people, and promiscuity and drugs are absolutely rife, okay? Remember I said to you before that the face of a man with a heavy moustache and handsome features, quite an interesting description, isn't it? Because as I said, it sort of fills you with a kind of warmth at first. And this is what's so terrifying about 1984. Why am I telling you this? Because in The Handmaid's Tale, the aunts are also like lovely relative mummy types, supposedly, but actually they're like dark and vicious mummies, aren't they, in many ways? The background to it, we know about the dictatorship, okay? And what's quite interesting is this term INSOC, okay? It bears, once again, a strong resemblance to the Soviet Union and to the notion that you can control people by making them join party life. And this is something that we're going to see in The Handmaid's Tale. It's a kind of coercive dictatorship, isn't it? In which you're given the illusion of choice, but actually everything is very tightly controlled. Nazi Germany obviously figures very prominently in 1984 as well, because not only do you have the coerciveness of communism, you have the darkest form of capitalism, which is this fascist idea. I'm going to suggest to you that the country of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale has strong Nazi resemblances, particularly things like parades, public executions, the use of terror, etc., in this particular way. The Nazis were absolute geniuses in terms of choreographed pieces. military parades, control of the media, the use of film. In fact, they helped pioneer things like aerial shots in film. And as you can see from this wonderful, wonderful photograph here, it really is like ancient Rome. Albert Speer, who was the great genius in terms of design of the Nazis, Hugo Boss, who designed their clothes, these were people who understood how important optics are. But we'll think about this when we're studying The Handmaid's Tale and see if any of this is relevant to us. Here's another amazing picture. Some of you may notice the Nazis used some of the insignia of Rome, which is, again, very powerful use of mythologies. Now, of course, the Nazis were not a Christian state. In many ways, they were an anti-Christian state, and they looked back to what they saw as a glorious kind of Viking, pagan, bloodthirsty culture, which they saw as pure and masculine. In The Handmaid's Tale, in contrast, we will deal with the Christian theocracy. And yet, it is also militaristic, is it not? If we think about the idea of the angels, they can be seen as the kind of stormtroopers of Jesus, can't they? In terms of the children of the revolution, in the Soviet Union, young people were encouraged to join a political group. I want you to think of this in The Handmaid's Tale, because you will recall that Offred's daughter, for instance, is co-opted into a kind of orphanage-like situation. And of course, both the Nazis and the communists in Russia were geniuses in terms of using child propaganda, mind control, etc., and this notion that you could mold people from a young age. So in fact, in both societies, the family was under attack, but particularly in communism, where the family was often presented as bourgeois corruption. And your loyalty should be first and foremost not to your relatives, but to the state. Now, I think we'll see some of that come through in The Handmaid's Tale. I won't spend too long on this particular slide, because, again, it's much of the same thing. Again, it's the notion about controlling youth, appealing to them, and getting their loyalty at a very young age. The Hitler Youth flourished, and in particular, an idea in Germany, of course, that many of you will know, of the Aryan race. The beautiful, blonde, folky girl, simple, uneducated, and good for breeding. Now, you may see some parallels then with the treatment of women in The Handmaid's Tale. This is perhaps the most important thing. It's the idea of surveillance and control. This is a telescreen, isn't it? And in the extract that we look at today, we'll see that in what's happened in Oceania is that there's a great deal of poverty. It's dilapidated, it's ineffective. It reminds one of post-war Britain, doesn't it? Ruined, ration books, etc., etc. And yet the ubiquitous telescreens, these telescreens that must cost quite a lot of money, taking so many of the resources. Let's not forget, the terrifying thing about the telescreen is it both projects a vision, but also receives and reports what is happening in the room. So it's a device for propaganda and eavesdropping simultaneously. If we think today what a prophet George Orwell was in many ways, as I'm sure some of you know, they can use hotel room phones now to pick up conversations, even when the phone is on the hook. Think about that next time you're having a talk. Newspeak we've spoken of. It shows Orwell's belief that language can be twisted to control thought. He was terrified of what's happening with language. I think many of us should be too. I think when we saw the Americans use terms like collateral damage for killing people, then we can see that euphemism, disguising words, kind of the lexical distortion of reality is terrifying. In this particular example, we have these oxymorons, don't we? War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. It seems that Orwell is trying to make the point that in these kind of propaganda-laden societies, the laws of non-contradiction that underpin Western thought and philosophy no longer apply. What are some of the really important themes, okay? the deprivation of privacy, the prohibition of sex, the destruction of history, the essential nature of memory, the appreciation of the past, the ultimate fallibility of the human mind. Each one of those themes occurs in The Handmaid's Tale. Can you recognize them? So again, that'll be a slide I want you to go back to and think about carefully, because I think that you'll see the incredible influence that Orwell had on Atwood. As I say, language is reduced. We do not see the aim, of news. So the aim of Newspeak is not only to narrow the range of thought, In the end, this is a quote from the book, we will make thought crime virtually impossible. That was the idea, that a careful control of language together with psychological conditioning using behaviorist techniques would mean that there is simply no opportunity for insubordination. That was the interesting thing. In fact, there will be no thought. Orthodoxy means no thinking. Orthodoxy is unconscious. It's quotes like these that make 1984 such a classic. This notion that you could eliminate individuality in thought itself entirely. Language will become ritualistic. Under his eye, blessed be the fruit. Do we see the similarities and the parallels then with The Handmaid's Tale? In terms of human connection, sex is seen as an unpleasant act, something for reproduction. When you make love, you feel happy and don't give a damn about anything. They can't bear you to feel like that. If you are happy inside yourself, why would you give a damn about Big Brother? So again, sexuality is seen as a terrible distraction, a diversion from duty. I think we can see lots of parallels there, can't we, with The Handmaid's Tale. When we look at Brave New World next, we'll see that sexuality is seen as another way of controlling you. Nothing to fear. Cooperate and obey. We are watching. Live in fear if you have any thoughts. Live with the notion that you're constantly under surveillance, that you might be being watched and listened to. Be paranoid. This is basically the universe of The Handmaid's Tale too. Thank you.